Hi, everybody. We're back looking at the Word of our Master, and we're going to be continuing our look at what Jesus said in Matthew 16 in response to Peter. If you remember, Peter has declared, and Jesus had asked, "So who do you, my disciples, who do you say I am?" And Peter responded by saying, "You are the anointed, the Son of God, Son of the living God." So what we're going to do is dive into the next part of this, and oh my goodness, all of this is so crucial, so important for us to understand, and that's why I didn't want to try to get it all in one video. So I'm going to be reading from verses 17 to 20, and this is again Jesus' response to Peter. I am able to look at comments and responses, so if you have any or questions as we go, please let me know. I usually am not able to look at it while I'm doing this, but my setup works for that today. But listen to Jesus' words. "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter." And just for the sake of what we're going to talk about later, when he says that in the Greek, it would say, "And I tell you that you are Petros." So that's one word that's translated rock or Peter. "And on this rock," now in this second reference to a rock, it's Petra. So, "And I tell you that you are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church, my assembly, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of the heavens. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven or in the heavens, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in the heavens." Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah, the anointed one. Now, this first part by itself is plenty to talk about, and lest I make this video super long, I'm going to stick to just this first part. Because this is actually a point of serious controversy. What did Jesus mean when he said that on this rock, Petra, I will build my assembly, my church? So, if you're familiar with the Roman Catholic teaching about this view of who Peter was being designated by Jesus to be in the life of the church, the idea is that the church would be built on Peter himself, and that role that would be passed on to others through what they now call the papacy. So they sit in the seat of Peter, the chair of Peter. Now, when the Reformation comes along, and it's not just them necessarily, but in the Reformation picture of things that reject the papal authority that the Roman Catholic Church embraces, this question now has to be wrestled through. Well, if it's not Peter the person, and therefore the role he plays, and those who might take on that mantle after him, then what did Jesus mean when he said, "On this rock I will build my church, my assembly"? And so it's worth investigating, and I try to do that to find out what to do with this text. Now, a common alternative view of what Jesus was saying was not that Jesus would build his assembly or his church on Peter the person, but rather on the statement Peter made. And the statement Peter made was that Jesus is the anointed, the Son of God. And so the response or argument against the idea that Peter is the one Jesus is building his church on is that Jesus is building his church on the confession that Peter had made. "You are the anointed, the Son of God." Both of those are actually possible in the text. I actually wanted to present to you a third alternative that I think brings them both together, in a sense, in a more satisfying way with what the other scriptures reveal about this whole notion. So, again, let me just read the verse with these distinctions so that I can explain a little bit more about that. So first of all, the revelation of who Jesus is, the certainty of that he is the anointed and the Son of God. Jesus says that is from the Father, not from mortal flesh and blood. This isn't something that humans just came up with on their own. Now, with that revelation of who Jesus is, that's clearly the context, he says, "And I tell you that you, singular, you are Peter." Now, he's been called this already, but Jesus is going to do a little play on words here. He says, "You are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my assembly, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it," the assembly. So, just wanted to give you a little information about the two words Jesus chose there, because this has a lot to do with, I think, the proper way to understand it. So the word Petros, which is Peter, the name given to Simon, son of Jonah, that is a reference to a smaller singular stone, could be even a pebble, but it's a smaller one, the kind that you might pick up with your hand, generally speaking. The only way that word is used in the entire New Testament, in the Greek language I'm saying, is for the name of this man, Peter. We don't see it used of a rock or a pebble anywhere that I found in all the uses in the New Testament. So clearly, when we read this word in the New Testament, it is the name for Simon, son of Jonah. It is the name Peter. Now, the word Petra, which is what Jesus said he's going to build his church or his assembly on, that word is actually very different in meaning, in the sense that a Petros is not a Petra. Okay, so I think there is a fair point to be made here, that Jesus didn't say he's going to build his church on the Petros, Peter himself. That's a fair thing to say, because he changed the word, and the word has a different meaning. When we talk about Petra, we're talking about a rock face, a large rock system. It's not just a singular stone. We're talking about like a cliffside. We're talking about what the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea was cut into. A gigantic side of a hill or a mountain. So, large massive rock, I think, is a good way to put it. That's what one of the Greek resources I have says. So, we're not talking about something you could hold in your hand and throw at somebody, not something you'd find on the side of the road. By the way, this language is also used of the rocky soil in the parable of the sower that we looked at several weeks ago. So, Jesus isn't saying the same thing when he uses the two words. He says, "I call you, Peter, a stone or a rock, hand size or smaller. But on the large, I'll just say, mountainous kind of rock, I'm going to build my assembly." Now, why is this distinction so important? Because as we look elsewhere to see what is Jesus' church built up on, we get more of an idea. We don't have to just stick to this one verse and wrestle through what is Petra and Petros, saying. And to me, this is so beautiful. It's so good. It goes way beyond whether Peter is the beginning of apostasy. That's not the issue, I don't think, in investigating this. So let me start by saying this. In Matthew 7, and we looked at this many moons ago, in Matthew 7, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus concludes his teachings by saying, "If anyone hears these teachings of mine and does what I say, they're like a man who builds his house on a Petra, rock." Now, you can't build your house on a pebble or a stone, right? You build your house on a large mass of rock, which is why the word Petra would be used. And Jesus speaks of the fact that building the house on the Petra allows the house to stand even though the storm comes against it. So the waters are rising, the wind is blowing. Now, the one who didn't build his house on the Petra, didn't have a solid rock foundation, when the storm comes, it collapses. And as Luke has in his version of that, it falls with a great crash, a loud sound. In Revelation 6, you get this word's usage in reference to rocks in the mountains. People are calling on the rocks in the mountains to fall on them. Again, they don't want to be pelted with little pebbles and stones. They want a large rock to crush them to help them escape this judgment. So you get the idea. Okay, now why is all that so relevant? Because we know from other passages of Scripture upon what the church is built. and it gives us some beautiful perspective of what Jesus meant. And then I'm going to loop back around to the text we're focused on just to kind of tie it up. But in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 11, Paul writes that you can't build on any foundation other than Christ in the kingdom work. You can't build on any other foundation than the one already laid down, which is Jesus, which is the anointed one, the Christ. So in 1 Corinthians 3:11, Paul gives us the clear picture that Jesus is the foundation. Now, just to point out, the reason I'm talking about foundation from here on out is because Jesus said building something on it, and so you clearly get the idea of a foundation. But also, think about it in the ancient world. What were their options for building on a foundation? What substances would they use for a foundation? Not steel or metal or something like that, surely. They typically would use, as Jesus indicated in that parable, when they were going to use a foundation, it would be a large stone mass, right? So that's why I'm connecting the idea of Petra to foundation, because Jesus speaks of building on a rock, and so just to say that's where I'm going with this. So when Paul compares Jesus to that rock foundation in 1 Corinthians 3:11, we're starting to see this language of building the church. Okay. In 1 Timothy 3:15, Paul calls the church God's household, and he calls the God's household, which is the church, the assembly, the pillar and foundation of the truth. Now that's interesting. So Jesus is going to build his assembly on the rock, Petra, and based on that on the foundation of the church or assembly, he's going to build up his truth. So isn't that interesting layering? A foundation, building on that, and then that's the foundation of something else. Now in Ephesians 2:20, this is the real, I think, the real focal point. And this connects us to Revelation 21:14. In Ephesians 2:20, Paul says that God's household, and again he's talking about the assembly. He says the church is the assembly. That is built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone, which rises up to be a holy temple in the Lord. So Paul is picturing the assembly of Jesus as God's household to be a holy temple. Now the holy temple is built on a foundation. He says the foundation, not just Jesus this time, like it was in 1 Corinthians 3:11. He says the foundation is the apostles and the prophets. The chief cornerstone of the foundation is Jesus himself. So the most important part of the most important part is Jesus. So he's not saying Jesus is no longer foundational. He's going even more specifically to how this could be envisioned. Okay, all that to say, if you are a part of Jesus' assembly, which is to speak of the gathering of all of his people, either locally his people or the larger picture of his assembly, the big C church or the little C church, if you like. What we understand from what Paul saw and understood is, I think, clarifying what Jesus was saying to these first apostles. That Jesus was not just going to build his assembly on one man, Peter, one smaller rock, but on this rock. And this is where, in my imagination, Jesus wasn't talking about the confession itself. He was talking about these men. That Peter, and interestingly, Peter uses this language in his letter later, Peter saw the different individual disciples of Jesus as living stones that together form a spiritual house for God. So Peter had in his mind that there are smaller stones that create the larger edifice. I see a similar picture when Jesus responds to Peter. You individually, Peter, are a stone, a rock, but on this, and again, I'm picturing this is not in the text, but on this rock, these 12 men, I will build my assembly. Now that connects us to Ephesians 2 because Paul wrote that the foundation of the assembly is the apostles and prophets. Now the confession comes into play here, and this is where I think the confession of who Christ is ties into Jesus' statement about building his assembly on the Petra, Why are the apostles the foundation? It's not just because there's 12 guys and Jesus just wants to build his assembly on 12 guys. It's because those were specifically chosen, and the word apostle means sent ones. They were authorized sent ones to be witnesses to his resurrection and triumph over death. His ascension to Father and his being seated at God's right hand. His death at the hands of his enemies that would later turn into triumph over sin, death, and all the enemies of God. So these men are foundational to the church being built because they bring the confession, not just that Jesus is Messiah, not just that Jesus is the Son of God, but that he is the resurrected one. He's the triumphant one. And that life is only found in him. That there's no other name given under heaven by which men must be saved. And all the things that they themselves saw and heard firsthand. If you read 1 John, for instance, what he's writing there is, we're going to write to you about things we have seen, we have heard, our hands have touched. We are witnesses of these things. And that's a phrase used throughout the book of Acts too. We saw it, guys. We're reporting things that we know from actual experience, not just philosophical pondering. So, going back, Jesus said, you are Peter, Petros, a stone, but on this stone structure or this stone mass of the apostleship all of you guys have, this message all of you guys are going to bring to the world, I'm going to build my assembly. Because it isn't accurate to say Peter alone is the foundation of the church. It doesn't make any sense. That's not how the story unfolds. But I don't think we need to shy away from the idea, if you're a quote-unquote Protestant, you don't have to shy away from the idea that Peter was a leader, and perhaps the leader, of the early church in a very significant way. The book of Acts follows Peter in the first chunk of it for a reason. But he wasn't the only one. He was what some have said, the first among equals, right? Like in King Arthur's court, the table was round because we're all equals, but there is a first among equals, if you like. So, anyway, I want to connect this to Revelation 21, verse 14 with you, because when John saw the new creation and he saw the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven to come be on earth, where God would dwell with his people forever, he describes the wall of the new Jerusalem as being having 12 foundations, which takes us back to Paul's words about the foundation of the church being apostles and prophets. Well, John saw that depicted, because the wall of the New Jerusalem city had 12 foundations, and here's what John reports. It had the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So those 12 layers of foundation represented the 12 apostles of the Lamb, who is Jesus. So the scriptures are clear, and I think give us exactly what we need to know to understand Jesus' words to Peter. You are a stone, Peter, and that's a big deal. That's going to be your name. That's how you're going to be known. I mean, honestly, if I talked about the Apostle Simon, you probably wouldn't think of Peter, because there was another Simon. So Peter is the way we know him, right? It's his given name was Simon. His Hebrew name was Simon. He came to be called by the Greek name of Petros, Peter. And that was always to remind us of the role he's going to play. He's kind of the face of the smaller face of the larger rock. So it's not just him, but he represents the whole that the church, the assembly, is going to be built on. Now here's why I'm excited about this reality. This verse doesn't need to become just a verse to squabble over about church hierarchy and whether the Pope is in the chair of St. Peter and things like that. What this really should be for us is an exciting understanding of who we are as a people. What you're a part of, if you're a disciple of Jesus, and I always want to encourage you, if you're not, please yield, submit, follow, learn, give yourself to him. Oh, it's the exact right thing for every person to do. Okay, but if you are a disciple of Jesus, you have become a living stone in a temple that is being built up, a spiritual house for God. The Spirit of God dwells in you. And the reason foundation language is so important is that we together need to know that we are built on something solid. Jesus has built an assembly not on ideas, but on experiential realities. There actually is in history a mark left by a man named Jesus of Nazareth who had eyewitnesses living, dwelling, and working alongside him, who saw that he had died, who saw him raised from death, who watched him ascend into heaven, and who gave their lives, lived their lives and then gave their lives to make all of that known to people. You and I have a life built on something real, not just mental exercises, reality, a history. This is crucial because the storm is going to come against your faith. The storm is going to come against you in so many ways, including doubts within your own self, but also claims in the world that what you believe and what you're a part of is outmoded and unsophisticated and archaic and whatever else. We don't need that stuff anymore. We have science and we understand things clearly now. We don't need all that superstitious stuff. All of those attacks, all the storms are going to come against you. And if you're not firmly built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, the true word of God that is rooted in history and reality, that is evidenced in history and reality, then you may not be able to stand when the storm comes. But if you hear Jesus' words, he's building his assembly on a rock, and his rock will not fall. And next time I'm excited to talk about the implications of the idea that the gates of Hades won't overcome his assembly, and that those in his assembly, at least the apostles, and we'll have to talk about if it's just them, will have authority in this world, this fallen, broken, dark world, to make real difference, real change. Why? Because they're built on something real, solid, and so strong. So be encouraged, disciples of Jesus. Dig into those evidences, dig into those realities that you are built on, that your church family is built on. You are in the household of God, and we have great power for victory against the dark one, because our Master Jesus is our cornerstone, and he is not going anywhere. He is solidly placed by God himself in the position he plays. Ooh, man. This verse, this is foundational, pun intended. I love you. May God bless you and encourage you. And until next time, walk loyally with Jesus, because he will always be loyal to you. Bye-bye.